All right, while they're handing out the mics, the topic I wanted to start with, because this is a great opportunity because of the people we have on the stage here. I think we're on the precipice in the NHL of, is that a word? I don't know if I made up a word, of the front office being completely transformed potentially, and what a front office looks like, especially with the growth of these analytics staffs. And I wanted to start with Alex because they're in Seattle. They're starting from scratch. It's pretty amazing. So there's really no constraints into what they want to do, and they have to build. And what she's building right now is with the future in mind. And so I was hoping, Alex, you would start and just tell us what the thought process was when you're talking about a front office structure, and where the analytics group, factors into that.
We're in this unique situation in which normally when you come to a team, you're working with existing personnel, you're trying to make yourself fit amongst an organization. But, I think that in my 7 months, 8 months at NHL Seattle now, we probably have had like 20 different versions of an org chart as we think about how we want to grow out our hockey operations department, and in particular, like the analytics, technology, research and development portion. And what I think is interesting is as hires have happened across the league over the last few years, a lot of times, it's the management, the executives that are making those hiring decisions. And that you want an analyst on staff. They realize it's important. That's why they're conducting the job search. But you don't necessarily maybe completely understand all the skill sets required to make that happen. When 5 years ago, when I originally was going to work in Minnesota, the only reason that I got that job was because Andrew Thomas, who you just saw up here, when he's talking to Minnesota, he says, I can do all this analytics work for you, but ultimately we need to have someone who knows how to work with the technology. We need to have someone who knows how to deal with the database, how to deal with communicating the data that we're working with to our stakeholders, to the people across the hockey operations department. So as we're building out this group, it's not just running the models, it's managing the data, it's managing the puck and player tracking data that will be coming into the league. It's how we're communicating that to people. So we're looking at hiring developers, data engineer, analysts, specializing in kind of these particular areas, whether that's pro scouting, player development, amateur scouting, and really thinking about, if you had the opportunity to integrate data across every aspect of the hockey operations department, what does that look like?
And so I'm interested, as you go through that process, Alex, you're in Seattle, which is, you have a great pool of talent in terms of, data scientists or engineers. How do you find the hockey knowledge? Like, how do you balance, or how important is hockey knowledge versus the ability to do a bunch of things that I don't understand?
So we put out 3 positions on Teamwork Online for our hockey research and development group. Data engineer, developer, and an analyst. And across the 3, we ended up with like 850 applications, which was a lot to go through. And what we found was there's such a great pool of candidates, especially on the technology side, just in Seattle. And the majority of those people are, hockey fans, whether native Seattleites or they've moved from Montreal, Vancouver, San Jose, Chicago. I think ultimately to work in this business, you have to have a passion for hockey, even if you're on maybe the more data technology side, just because, it's what you're going to spend all your day doing, and most of your nights, some of your nights during the season.
So Ryan, with the Blues, you've been a part of that organization a long time, so you've seen, rather than having a blank slate, you're growing that structure within a pretty established front office with a veteran general manager. What's that process been like, and what kind of challenges come with that scenario versus a clean slate like Seattle's had?
I think having an established front office, the same group has been together for the better part of 10 to 15 years now, really since Doug came on, when Larry was still the general manager. And I think it provides its own set of challenges. On the one hand, it's a lot easier to ascertain, or not easier, but it's more direct to ascertain what do we think we need, or what do we want, or how do we want to go about this. But it also makes it a little more challenging because like you said, you don't have the ability just to start totally blank. So we've gone through with each department within our hockey operation, amateur scouting, pro scouting, coaching, we've gone through different iterations of how do we do this, how do we present it, and the nice thing about having continuity and having consistency in the personnel inside the room is that when we go to our meetings in June with the amateur staff, we know what worked last time. We know what we like. We know the stuff that didn't work, that didn't really take off, whether it's a visualization method or a specific metric or a way of communicating something. We have that basis of knowledge, so it allows us to be a little more effective in how we communicate and what we do, and really fine-tune it to each individual group.
And Matt, what I'm interested with you with Philadelphia is you have, and we touched on it this morning with the Rangers and MSG, but you have an NBA team that traditionally the NBA has been a little bit out front in terms of analytics. What have you stolen from them, or how do you lean on kind of their experience when you're saying, okay, here's how, as we grow, we want to structure our front office?
Yeah, I think we've been. Is it on? Here. I don't know how to. Okay. We'll go with this. I think we've been really fortunate. The 76ers have kind of welcomed us with open arms and have really been an open book to show us what they've built. And I think the thing that's almost been most useful is them just really sharing their mistakes and what they've done wrong, basically, over the, I think, 5 or 6 years that their core group has been there, really to help us avoid a lot of the pitfalls, particularly as we think about how are we going to start to ingest all of this new data that's going to be coming in. What type of personnel do we need? What type of architecture, what type of infrastructure do we need to be setting up so that when tracking data does start coming in, you know, we don't feel like we're in over our heads completely and we don't have to learn some of the hard lessons that I think other teams have learned.
Can you share any of the mistakes the 76ers has made that they've...
No.
Is your boss in the audience?
He may be.
So, Bill, for those of you who don't know, with Bill Zito, he's in the Columbus Blue Jackets front office, but he also started an agency. He's a former player agent, started that from scratch. So Bill has seen the evolution of that side of it and building a business. You've seen it in the NHL level. And I'm curious, as you see things evolve and you see those trends, like, what do you think the NHL front office of the future looks like? Or where do you see that evolution continuing?
Where's the shell game?
Turn them on. There's an on switch.
You didn't tell us.
We're not technology
Matt.
people.
These are the smartest people in hockey, ladies
Where's
and
the
gentlemen.
tech guy? We've really been blessed here in Columbus because we had the luxury of having Josh Flynn, who you probably all know by now today, who was in management, who was on the cutting edge of the analytics, movement, ideas, what have you, who was doing this sort of thing, who was also on the hockey side doing scouting. We have a GM, Jarmo Kekalainen, who's on the cutting edge, always asking why, always asking what else. We brought in a guy from St. Louis, Nelson Ayet, sort of as our director of, we called it high performance. So on the strength and conditioning side, we were always, what else can we do? Whether it's sleep, whether it's coordination, whatever else we can do to get better. And we're trying to do it on a budget and be as efficient as we can. Josh went and found Zach, and we continued to sort of evolve in this quasi-questioning manner, but always looking to get better within the constraints of our budget. And so as we grow, we're asking how and why we do it. And I see that the evolution of the front office as this growing entity where you're not exactly sure where it's going to go. So we have all this new data coming in. How are we going to use it? What are we going to do? Are we going to have to hire our engineers? Are we going to be able to farm it out? Is the league, you know, we have the sport logics in these entities. Are there going to be more? Are we going to be able to pool our resources as a league for some of it, for efficiency? Are the smaller franchises going to be able to get together and somehow be as efficient as we can in our spending for data collection? Is there going to be another haves versus have-nots on the data collection part? I don't know. actually, but I can see the horizon of the future. How much of this is then going to transcend into the coaching, into the player development, onto the physical side, into the development of the athletes, and then, you brought up the scouting end of things. We talked the other day about player and puck tracking. How valuable would it be just to have it in the CHL? Because right now, if we hit 2 out of 7 on the draft, we're fantastic. If we get 2 players each draft, is that good enough? And how much more valuable could this data be to us? Just knowing that on these draft eligible players. So the horizon is it's exciting.
Yeah, and so along those lines, in talking in prepping for this, I was talking to an analyst, and they said, can you please mention culture and attitude of the people that you're bringing in and having them fitting in the front office? They felt like that was such an important thing for people that are looking to get into this world to have. And what they said, this is a quote, they said, there seems to be a lot of confidence that the answers that they have are the end-all be-all. This is some people in analytics, and this is a person in analytics saying this. The truth of the matter is the data that we're working with, any conclusions we make have to have a confidence level that we can estimate. So I think it's like, here's what we're discovering. It's not black and white necessarily. So Alex, I'd be curious, how much is when you're talking to people and you're doing all these interviews over the last 6-8 months, how much are you watching basically like culturally, how are they going to fit? How is their attitude, their confidence level, and understanding how it's going to work into the hockey world?
Yeah, I think we talk about wanting to establish this great NHL Seattle culture across the hockey operations department, across the whole company, but we have 7 hockey operations employees right now, so what really is our culture? It's something that we're getting to decide as we go. And ultimately, I think that talking about kind of confidence in your data, a scout may not really want to understand or really know what a confidence interval is. To me, it's more about how you deliver information, and are you willing to, when you sit down at a table, if you're in a scouting meeting, are you pounding the table and saying, well, my model says this player is way better than what you're saying, or are you just kind of raising the question? Or is it something that maybe you visit with someone privately offline? Are you calling someone out for thinking that their opinion is completely wrong? You want people to kind of fit just in general, pass the beer test, right? Is it someone you want to sit down and kind of have a beer or a coffee with after the scouting meetings are over?
Yeah. Ryan, you've dealt, again, with some old school coaches, GMs. How is that? How do you find that translation, or interacting with that?
Well, one of the things that we've had a lot of success with is taking the approach from the analytics department out, of saying this is going to probably ask more questions than it's going to provide answers. And what we found is that it gives us an advantage, or it benefits us in 2 ways primarily. First of all, it lowers the defenses of people who come to a meeting thinking that you're trying to tell them that they're wrong. In allowing them to say this is just a conversation. We're asking questions. We're not providing a lot. We're providing answers, but we're not telling you, well, this guy has so many. He's won so many loose puck recoveries. He must be more competitive than this other guy because he has a lower number. So we're able to have the conversation more productively when we take that approach. And then secondly, what it does is it allows the scouts and the coaches to come back to us with their own. Our coaching staff is really good about this part of the process. Is they do their own share of some of the work in understanding and implementing the stuff that we get from the analytical data, but they also come back to Mike and say, well, this doesn't make sense to me. How does this number get so high when we're doing X, Y, and Z, or something like that? So it lowers the defenses, and then it gives each individual staff member, scout, coach, whoever it is, the platform to say, how does this translate? To ask us the question, and instead of just force feeding information to someone, you're giving them something that they want. It's more efficient, it's a clearer communication, and it ends up being way more effective in trying to ram down, well, we think this is important, here's why, and we've got to do X, Y, and Z.
And you were saying that there's nothing better than when the data actually matches up with what they see, like
that's
these
the
Hall of
Holy
Famers.
Grail.
What's that?
That's the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
We had an instance, really a breakthrough moment. It was with a former coaching staff member, and we had a player who was his defensive zone passing percentage was not very good. And what we did was we went back and looked at the video of what was going on here, and it became really clear in relatively short order that this guy was going back to retrieve a puck and had no idea what was going on behind him. He wasn't checking over his shoulder, wasn't even really looking for a reflection. So we were able to say, we started with this. We went right to the coach and say, okay, we started with this. Why is this happening? And here is why we think that's happening based on watching the game. This isn't anything, it starts numerically based, it starts based in the data, but it quickly becomes a hockey conversation, a pure hockey conversation of now you can go and tell the player, hey, take a peek over your shoulder, take a look at what you're doing, and sure enough, over the course of the next season, that passing percentage went back up. It actually improved something on the ice, and we thought that was one of the best examples that we've had of taking something, starting with the data in the information, and then having it make a tangible effect on the ice.
Right. So that's the Holy Grail. I, as someone who enjoys conflict from the outside in the media, I like when it's the opposite, right? When the data says one thing and hockey tradition says the opposite, or just how this is how the game has always been played. And so I'm always curious, when there's a gap, and I'm going to start with you, Bill, and maybe there's not exact examples of this, but like if the data says one thing and John Tortorella, who may be opinionated about how the game should be played, I don't know John real well. Like, how do you bridge that gap, or how often does that come up, or what is that like? What are those discussions like?
Well, there's two examples. One we talked about before we came up, and one is when to pull the goalie. Yeah. And there have been a number of studies that have come out, and I think most of you are familiar with the one that says, 6 minutes, or what's the certainly
it's pretty
it's
the ones that I've seen are
yeah.
really aggressive.
Right.
I mean, depending on the score and the time.
And he has adjusted. He's gotten more liberal on that one. We did have one situation where there was an in-game situation that happens, and we went to him and said, you have to change the way you coach. And he said, what are you talking about? We said, you have to do this. The data tells us this. He says, are you sure? We said, yeah, we're sure. 100%? We said 99%. He changed. And we do it every time. And
Can you tell us exactly what that strategy change was?
I could, but it makes a difference. And he's open-minded, he's receptive, and I think it's a testament to, we don't really have an analytics department, and these guys we're all kind of vertically and horizontally integrated throughout and among everybody, and people are encouraged to ask questions and to share ideas, and it might be where the scouts reach out to Zach or Josh and say, hey, can we quantify this? What about this? Can we do that? And it's really healthy, and I think it's exciting, and a lot of times it's fun. Sometimes you can't do it. Sometimes the ideas aren't great. But sometimes you can grow and it can get better, and it's the same with the coaching staff, where the communication, I think that's the key to the whole thing.
Yeah. Matt, have you found examples where there's a gap between what the data says and how the game's being played?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be conflicts between what the data recommends and what, scouts, coaches, management think all the time. I think we tend to view conflict as a negative thing, but I don't really think that it necessarily is, because I think those are the areas where we really push each other, and we have to question our assumptions, they have to question their assumptions, and that's how you get to a better understanding of the game. That's how you get to a better understanding of a particular player or a particular strategy. And, it's like you said, 85, 90% of the time, the numbers agree with what coaches, scouts say. It's the 10% where we make progress.
I always like that when, because coaches will say, yeah, we're looking at all this shot data. Yeah, of course we want to shoot in the home plate area. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks a million red dots. But it's like, that's the ideal, and I think there's extra value when it's
you need to have something that agrees with the coaches, otherwise you're not going to make any progress. So you got to set the baseline that says, yeah, we agree 95% of the time. Let's focus on the 5% to make us better.
So we talk a lot in analytics or in the media about using it for roster construction. We talk a lot. We talk a lot about coaching strategy. What we don't hear a ton about is analytics in the use of contract negotiations and managing the salary cap. And when I saw this panel, I saw a great opportunity to touch on that because we have, a guy who's done 1 million contracts. How many contracts do you think you've done in your life, Billy?
1 million.
At least, yeah. Matt Kane, I mean, that's how I got to know your work was your salary projections. Ryan, you've done, you've been running a cap for forever.
Fewer than 1 million contracts.
But a few. So Bill, let me start with you on that. Having done so many contracts, where do you see analytics giving teams or agents, because I know agents are using them too, an advantage in moving forward and managing a cap and in negotiating deals?
On the negotiating deal side, it has to get accepted, right? As far as the arbitration years, as those.
You can't use it in ARB, right? You can't.
Well, as it evolves and whatever gets accepted, whatever data is allowed into the ARB, then we'll get into the negotiation. As far as your valuation of the player, it may very well play a role, particularly how you value the player. If the analytics are telling you, we don't value him that high, well then it's just gonna dictate, quite literally, how you value the player. So it can get in, and certainly when you talk about the UFA years, you can use that perhaps to persuade agents and what have you. And same thing as it's all about just valuing the player. Plain and simple. It's rather elementary.
I just think aging curves have impacted. You've seen UFAs, and maybe we still see bad contracts, but I do think that's made a big. People are like, boy, I don't know if I want to give this guy 7 years when he's 29.
And some of the things that the agents throw at you from the analytics standpoint, it's pretty special. I imagine you guys have heard the same thing.
Come on, tell us something an agent has told you analytically.
I'll have to think of some. Let me think. And
Let's get to Matt. You think of a good agent story. So Matt, can you explain your model and from start to beginning?
And to do this very high level.
Yeah. And I think it's always remarkable when we would see it and be like, oh yeah, that was spot on, and it was I think that becomes a very valuable tool when we're doing deals moving forward.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know the model is basically used to predict, what contract a player is going to get when they become a free agent based on their historical stats. One of the interesting things going from, doing this in public and putting out a list of, a few hundred names and a few hundred projections to using it for a team is you go from, it's right on average to is this right for this specific player? And it becomes a lot more, you've got to challenge on a case-by-case basis there. Are the assumptions we've made to generate this player's projection still valid? Do we think that there's anything in how that player's stats got generated that may want us to reconsider whether that's an appropriate projection or not? It puts a lot more pressure on the projection than just, throwing a spreadsheet out and saying, hoping for the best, but, it's what you want to be doing with it ultimately.
Yeah. How about with you, Ryan? I mean, you've been doing a lot of cap management, and I think what I've always admired about the Blues, and I don't know how much say you've had in this, is they've always been willing to make really tough decisions on players. I think they were out early on that. It was, there was trading Kevin Shattenkirk while competing and letting David Backes walk, and really tough decisions that hockey teams, frankly, didn't always make. And I'm just curious, how big a role do analytics play when you start talking about contracts or even just cap management?
The phrase that we've used kind of over the years is another voice at the table, and I think we have a group that was early adapter as far as considering the analytics, quote unquote, or advanced statistics in making decisions. We have a group that's extremely open-minded about considering all different channels of information, whether that's from a scout or from an analyst, from a coach, whoever it is. So it's considered in everything. And just like you may not agree with one scout every time, you may not agree with one coach every time, you may not do one thing the same way every time, we've made decisions that we knew this isn't what the analyst would prefer to do. We know we've made some decisions considering putting heavy weight on what do the numbers say. But it's been a factor in all of the decisions that we've made, and I think that's a byproduct of having a group that's open-minded to it, but also a group that's highly experienced.
And Alex, you can just tell me no on this question because I'm maybe treading on state secrets, but one of the theories with Vegas and the success they had was that first year was they were getting max contribution salary-wise. There was no dead money on their books because everybody they brought in, like they didn't have bad loyalty contracts left over for the most part. It was a max effort up and down the lineup, and it seems like every other team around the league has one or two really bad contracts left over from a previous regime. When you're starting from scratch, you don't have that. So I'm curious how much you guys are using that kind of cap management, or just in general, how you're using analytics to say, okay, we want to make sure we're starting with a clean slate. We want to make sure we take advantage of this to the biggest in your modeling and kind of planning.
Yeah, so the great thing about starting from a clean slate is that we get to make all of our own mistakes, and we don't get to blame any of our mistakes on anyone else. But, we're certainly considering it as we, start running through like mock expansion drafts, right? Like, I think the cap comes into play there because you understand that you want to understand every other team's current cap situation and which contracts maybe they may be falling out of love with over the next few years. So, I think that's where we're looking at that now. And just to comment kind of on the contracts and salary cap, like I think without bringing analytics to the negotiation table, which the group has commented up here, like until it's really accepted in salary arbitration, you can only do so much when you're placing value on a player and what he's going to get in the market. But ultimately, just like using regular data, I mean, just when you're talking about points per game, that's something that is maybe less utilized across some contract negotiations than you would think. So I think just putting data in front of agents is sometimes powerful, and I think that as the industry evolves, it's going to come from both sides, and it already is. And ultimately, like, teams want to give players, I think, fair contracts, and agents want to get fair contracts for their players. So.
And I think a great example of that has been shooting percentage over the last, let's say, 5 or 10. It used to just be like, hey, this guy had 40 goals last year. Let's give him a huge contract. And finally, it was like people were like, hey, he shot 19% last year. Like that's not going to happen again. And yeah, it doesn't always have to be some advanced metric, like Alex said. It can just be something simple like that. Billy, did you think of your agent story yet?
No. It's out there.
All right, fair enough. All right, so we were talking about the goalie presentation that was before us, and one of the things, we hear a lot in analytics, goalies or voodoo or whatever, we can't analyze goalies. And I am curious, so in talking to Bill, like when he had his agency, he was identifying goalies, like Tim Thomas kind of came out of nowhere, Tuukka Rask came out of nowhere, maybe to us, maybe not to you, Bill. Do you think I think a lot of that, and then Columbus obviously has done a good job identifying goalies. That's kind of been traditionally scouting. How do you meld analytics into that in those projections moving forward? Or maybe you already are. I don't know.
In fairness, Tuukka was a first-round draft pick.
Yeah. All right.
So
he didn't come out of nowhere. Tim Thomas, though.
No, Timmy was hidden right in front of everybody, and it was his. I think it was his style more than anything else that scared the bejesus out of the scouts and said, I can't really step up for this guy who's flopping all over the place. This is a growing area. We're very fortunate. We had a guy named, and we have to give him credit, a guy named Ian Clark, who was here. He's in Vancouver now, who did the yeoman's work on the scouting of Elvis and of Tarasov, another young guy who's coming. And I think it was, I wasn't here, who I represented Corpy, but I wasn't here. Who was, the amateur guys, like Corpy, but this is another area that's evolving. It's like what I was talking about. What do we not know yet, and what's coming in this next wave of statistics that's going to help us on the goalie side? So it's pretty simple to say, does he stop the puck? But hasn't that really been something that's been consistent? And what's going to happen next? I don't know.
I think goaltending's fascinating. Matt, where do you see the next, like, where do you see the next development in terms of, okay, there may be opportunity in this gap, you know, to mine a little bit?
In goaltending?
Or just in general, I would say. I mean, I think goaltending is ripe for it, but
I mean, I think player and puck tracking data is going to give us a lot more insight, and you see what Cole was able to do with, you know, just, you know, the rudimentary level stuff with, you know, putting it together for this talk. I think what's exciting about stuff like player and puck tracking is that there's 31 teams that are probably going to go in 31 different directions in search of that next step of value, and I think there's going to be probably 29 teams who, you know, go down rabbit holes that don't lead anywhere, and 2 teams who happen to, you know, spring upon something that, you know, maybe looks promising, and you just, you know, you put all your effort into making sure that you're being really rigorous at every step of the stage to ensure that you're, you know, not following down those rabbit holes too far just because your hypothesis leads you one way. You have to just listen to the data at that point.
how about you, Ryan? Where do you see the next development? I mean, player tracking to me, it seems like the obvious answer here. But and we got into it in the morning session, so I don't want to go too crazy. But like, I am curious where you see the biggest development.
I think it's a good question. I think a lot of the, and it's really kind of starting to develop if it hasn't already, but looking more seriously or more closely at player movement prior to an action occurring. I think we heard a little bit about it in the goaltending presentation a minute ago. You know, all shots aren't created equally. You think about a player like an Austin Matthews or a David Perron who can move the puck immediately prior to an elite level release, and it makes them much more dangerous than just shooting the puck from that same spot on the ice. So the movement that occurs, players and pucks, and somebody said it earlier that we now know where the players are, but we don't yet know where the sticks are. Getting a better understanding of the movement immediately prior to something occurring, I think, is something that is ripe for development. And there is some work already going on. I'm not discounting any of that. But I think that's a really interesting area that we haven't quite touched on, because the data is really, you've got to work hard for a little bit of data in that context.
All right, we're down to our last 5 minutes. The last thing I was hoping to touch on is I'm fascinated by the concept of using analytics to build a coaching staff. And it's interesting about John Tortorella, because I remember when he was hired in Columbus, the analytics community just hammered it. Like his Corsi percentages in Vancouver and I think New York were not great. And I just remember one story in particular, just crushed it. And it's worked out. I would say, John's it's worked out for you guys. Fair to say. You're happy with that hire? So, so I'm curious, and I'm going to start with Alex, because again, it's a clean slate. I would be curious where analytics, when you're assessing a coaching staff and you're making those hires, how you see that evolving and how much of a factor that factors in.
First, I just want to call Matt out because he said 31 teams, and there are 32 now. Yeah, I mean, I think that as we sort of start to think about who the first head coach of Seattle will be, for me at least, it's less about, okay, can I rank every coach in the league, or can I think about specific things that the type of team that we're building we want the coach to sort of implement, or the types of players we're going to be getting, which coaches have maximized those sorts of players in the past. So in some ways, and I think in general, a lot of times, like when I think about analytics throughout an organization, you kind of look at it as a BS detector in some ways, right? So I think when you're in an interview, if a coach is saying, this is what I like to do tactically, and then we can say, okay, well, does the data support this or not? That's a tool that we'll utilize.
Yeah, and I love that point. Does the coach coach the way you want to play as an organization? Because I think we saw that a little bit with Toronto, with Kyle Dubas saying, look, I'm going to bet on this coaching change fitting the roster better that I've constructed. And in St. Louis, you guys have gone through a couple of coaches. Like Craig Berube doesn't strike me as an analytics guy necessarily, but so I think there's a lot of factors. Like he came in and had the respect of that room. Like there's a lot of like these outside factors that I think are hard to quantify. How do you balance all of that?
You'd have to ask my boss that question.
Yeah.
But no, it goes back to what I said a minute ago about being open-minded. Our coaching staff does a lot of work in this area. They're more than open to it. They actively seek it out. They work closely with Mike, who's our hockey data analyst, on a game-to-game, day-in, day-out basis, and they're open-minded to it. Sometimes it turns into something that they implement, and sometimes it doesn't. But they're open-minded to it, and the assistant coaches do a lot of work in that area to really keep us current, if not towards the kind of the leading edge of having your coaches work toward having firsthand knowledge instead of someone telling them. It's a really healthy process when they keep an open mind and they're willing to at least consider it, and Craig is certainly in that group.
All right, Billy, we're going to leave the stage, but last chance to tell the agent story? No? It's still a no? Afterwards, will you tell me?
I'll make up a good one.
All right, thanks.
I'm sure I probably told a worse one than anyone's ever told me.
All right, well, thank you guys. Give them a round of applause. They were a lot of ground covered. Thank you so much for doing that.